Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Southern Sorcery, where we understand that your time is your most valuable resource, and we thank you for choosing to spend some of it with us. With no further ado, let's get right on into it on today's episode of The Breakdown. We are looking at Mondrak, Glory Dominus. He is a 4-mana, 4/4 Phyrexian horror that says, if you make a token, make 2 of them instead. He gets nasty. He's got some built-in staying power. We are going to abuse him and make all the tokens. It's just going to be mono white token madness. So without any further ado, let's look at the creatures in this deck. First up, we've got some other token creators, token doublers, token triplers, and let's take a look at these. First up, we've got a brand new card from the latest set, Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and it is Ozhur-Tok. He is a 6/6 god that costs 4 and 2 white, and he has vigilance and says if one or more creature tokens would be created under your control, make 3 times as many instead. So this gets out of hand really fast, and then you put Mondrak in on top of it, you're talking about 5 times as many tokens, and they compile. Like, it gets out of control super fast. Ozhur-Tok is also a unique card in that he doesn't die when he dies. You flip him over. He becomes a land called Temple of Civilization, which taps for a white, and then also has a second tap ability where you can transform him back into Ozhur-Tok. If you attack with 3 or more creatures, you can pay 2 and a white and then tap it to flip him back over to his creature side. So pretty easy to get him back. Also, pretty cool there. Next up, we've got Gandalf the White from the Lord of the Rings, and he is an Avatar Wizard, a 4/5 for 3 white, and he has Flash, and then he lets you cast legendary creatures and artifacts as if they had Flash. So it gets you instant speed there. And then his second ability is what we're really after, and that is if a legendary permanent or artifact entering the battlefield would trigger the ability of a permanent you control, that ability triggers a second time. So if for some reason we make tokens, we make twice as many tokens, and then Mondrak sees that and makes another twice as many tokens. So just another way to keep that train rolling. Then we also have Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. She is a legendary Phyrexian Praetor, 4 and a white for a 4/7 with vigilance, and says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers a second time. So the same thing as Gandalf, just not restricted to legendary creatures and artifacts the way that he is. And then she has another clause that says permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponent's control to trigger. So it smothers their enter the battlefield triggers. So those are all kind of the same. They, if Mondrak's not out, you've got one of the other ones out if he gets removed. If not, they just compile onto each other, and they see each other making the tokens, and they see each other doing the extra triggers, and they just double them. Next up, we've got a couple of white staples. We've got Thalia's Lieutenant. When Thalia's Lieutenant enters a battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each other human creature that you control. And then when a human creature enters a battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Thalia's Lieutenant. Next, we've got God Eternal Oketra, 3 white for a 3/6 with double strike, a zombie god, and says whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. And then his second ability says, when God Eternal Oketra dies or is exiled, put him in your library 3rd from the top. So he's got a way to stick around a little bit when he gets removed or exiled. Next, we have our token creating portion of our deck. So all these next creatures generate tokens. So we've got Thraben Doomsayer. He's a 2/2. You tap him to create a 1/1 white human creature token. So once a turn, you can make some. Ancient Gold Dragon is a 5 white for a 7/10 Elder Dragon. He has flying that says whenever Ancient Gold Dragon deals combat damage to a player, roll a d20 and then make that many 1/1 blue fairy dragon creatures with flying. So yeah, you roll a d20, you roll a 7, Mondrak says make it 14. Ozhur-Tok makes it 21. Like, it just gets out of hand real fast. Next, we have Leonin Warleader. He is a cat soldier. He costs 2 white, is a 4/4, and says whenever Leonin Warleader attacks, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with lifelink that are tapped and attacking. Next, we've got a white staple, Monastery Mentor, 2 and a white for a 2/2 with prowess, and says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 monk creature token with prowess. And prowess is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. Next, we have Hero of Bladehold. This is another human. It's a 2 white white for a 3/4 with battle cry, which says whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. And whenever Hero of Bladehold attacks, make 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. Now we've got Teshar, Ancestors Apostle. It is a bird cleric, 3 and a white for a 2/2 with flying that says whenever you cast a historic spell, return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And then historic spells are defined as artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. Next on the recursion train, we have Sun Titan. He is 4 white white for a 6/6 giant with vigilance that says whenever Sun Giant enters the battlefield, return a target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Teshar only lets you get back creature cards. Sun Titan lets you get back any permanent. Next, we've got a little bit of ramp, which is hard to come by in mono white. So we have Knight of the White Orchid, which is a human 2/2 for white white that has first strike and says when Knight of the White Orchid enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for planes and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So he goes and gets you a land, puts it straight onto the battlefield. You can use it immediately. Next, we've got a white mana dork, which is Goldmere for 2. We also have Loyal Warhound for 1 and a white. It is a dog. It is a 3/1, has vigilance, and whenever Loyal Warhound enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So not quite as good as Knight of the Orchid. We also have Solemn Simulacrum, which is an artifact creature, costs 4, for a 2/2 that says whenever this creature enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, then put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And when this creature dies, you may draw a card. Next up, we've got Elesh Norn, Grand Centibite. This is the original OG Elesh Norn. It is 5 white white for a 4/7 creature with vigilance, Phyrexian Praetor. Other creatures you control get +2/+2. Creatures your opponents control get -2/-2. So this is just a way, once you have a whole lot of tokens out, you get her out, it buffs him up a little bit, potentially clears the board with the -2/-2 for everybody else's stuff, and lets you get in to swing in for a win. Now we've got some card draw, stapled to some creatures here. First up, we've got White Human Classic Esper Sentinel 1 for a 1/1 that says when an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. Now we've got Platoon Dispenser. It is an artifact creature for 5, and it's a 4/6, and says at the beginning of your end step, if you control 2 or more other creatures, draw a card. And then also has the ability pay 3 and 1 white to create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. And then you can also unearth this for 4. Next we have Lauren of the Third Path, 2 and a white for a human artificer. That is a 2/1 with vigilance and says when Lauren of the Third Path enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. So that's kind of nice. We got a little removal there. And then you can also tap it for you and a target opponent to draw a card. Next, we've got Archivist of Ogma. This is a 1 white 2/2 for a halfling cleric with flash that says whenever an opponent searches their library, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Next, we've got Rumor Gatherer. This is an elf wizard, a 2/1 for 1 and white white that has alliance. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, draw a card instead. So you'll draw a card on the second time that happens, and then you can continue scrying afterward. Next, we've got Benny Brax, Zoologist. He is a 3/2 elf druid for 3 and a white that says Convoke. So that means you can tap your other creatures to pay for the mana cost to cast him. And at the beginning of each end step, if you created a token this turn, draw a card. So that's on your turn and others' turns as well. So if you use an instant to create some, or you have a trigger that goes off and you create one at the end step, you still draw a card. Next, we've got a little bit of protection. We have Mother of Runes. You can tap her to give a target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until the end of turn. So just a way to protect something. And then Grand Abolisher for white for a 2/2 and says during your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. So it just keeps people from being able to do stuff on your turn. Next up, we've got a few finishers. We've got 3. First, we have Abzan Falconer, 2 and a white that has Outlast. which you can pay 1, tap it, and put a 1/1 counter on this creature, so he can give himself +1/+1 counters. And then each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has flying. So this comes in handy a lot. We run a couple of ways to put +1/+1 counters on creatures, on tokens, and to be able to give them flying is really nice. This card has done some serious work. Next up, we've got Mirror Entity. It is a shapeshifter that is a 1/1 for 2 and a white that says Changeling. This card is every creature type, and then has the second ability, which is what we want, and it is X. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So if there are certain enchantments and things we have out that only grant things to humans, other humans you control, everything gains human. So that would apply to all of our creatures, no matter what they are. And then you can buff them up, sink a bunch of mana into it, and then potentially swing out and get through. And our last finisher card is a brand new card from Wilds of Eldraine. It is Moonshaker Cavalry. It is 5 white, white, white for a 6/6 with flying that says, when Moonshaker Cavalry enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X until the end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control. If that sounds familiar, it's probably because it's essentially a Craterhoof Behemoth, and instead of trample, it grants flying, and Craterhoof itself has haste. This does not. So a slightly downgraded version. However, it is in white, and in this deck with all of our tokens, flying is almost just as good as trample. That rounds out our creatures for this deck. Next up, we have sorceries. We have got Devout Invocation, which is 6 and a white, so an expensive sorcery. However, tap any number of untapped creatures you control, put a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield for each creature tapped this way. And again, with our commander out, it's going to be twice as many. So if we've already made 12 tokens, we can tap 12 tokens and make 24 4/4 white angels with flying. So it's going to get, out of control, well worth the 7 mana that it cost. Next we have Spectral Procession. It is white, 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 or alternatively 2/2/2 colorless. For a sorcery that says put 3 white 1/1 spirit creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield. This card has saved me a few times as well. One of the weaknesses in this deck is the lack of flying creatures, and this is a good way to get a few 1/1 blockers out if you're playing against a Dragon's deck or a Flyers deck, whatever that might be. Next, we have White Sun's Twilight. It is X white white for a sorcery that says you gain X life. Create X 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. If X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. So with our commander out, we have tokens out. We can sacrifice a couple of those tokens to give him indestructible, which will keep him out on the board when this gets cast. If you cast it for the 5 or more, you'll destroy everybody else's creatures, and then you'll make X 1/1 Phyrexian Mites with Toxic 1. That should pretty much clear the way for you to just make a whole bunch of toxic creatures. Everyone else's creatures are gone, and you can swing out with those and kill everyone with poison counters. And our last sorcery is Hour of Reckoning. It is 4 white, white, white for a sorcery that has Convoke, so you're never going to pay 4 white, white, white. You're probably just going to, play it for free. And this says, destroy all non-token creatures. So in a world where we're hopefully going to have 20, 30, 40 tokens on our board at any given time, we can destroy everything else. Next up, we have some instants, and we have first, Call the Coppercoats. It is 2 and a white. For an instant, says Strive. This spell costs 1 and a white more to cast for each target beyond the first. Choose any number of target opponents. Create X 1/1 white human soldier creatures, where X is the number of creatures those opponents control. So if one person has a big board, you don't need to pay the Strive cost. You can just cast it and make that many 1/1s, or twice that many 1/1s if Mondrak is out. Or if there are multiple players that have large board states, you can just pay the 1 and a white extra and make that many more 1/1s. Next up, we have Entrapment Maneuver. This is a nice little combat trick to make you a whole bunch of tokens. It is 3 and a white and says target player sacrifices an attacking creature. You create X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens where X is that creature's toughness. So if they've got something big, dragon, whatever the case might be, something big, then you're going to make that many tokens, and then they sacrifice the creature as well. So it removes a threat and makes you a whole bunch of stuff. Next, we've got some protection, and it is Flawless Maneuver. It is 2 and a white. For an instant, if you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. Creatures you control gain indestructible until the end of turn. Great little protection spell. Next up, we have the infamous Teferi's Protection. Super popular. 2 and a white. Until your next turn, your life total can't change. You have protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out. And then you exile Teferi's Protection. The only thing that can get around this is commander damage and poison counters. Next, we've got a little bit of removal. We have got Path to Exile. It is 1 white. To exile a target creature, its controller may search their library for a basic land, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. Next, we have Swords to Plowshares. It is also 1 white, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Next, we have Generous Gift. It is 2 and a white to destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token, so it can hit anything, not just creatures. We also have Disenchant, 1 and a white to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now we've got a potential finisher, which is Akroma's Will for 3 and a white, and it says choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast this spell, you may choose both. And the first one is creatures you control gain flying, vigilance, and double strike until the end of turn. And the second one says creatures you control gain lifelink, indestructible, and protection from all colors until the end of turn. So if you can choose one, if you choose the second one, it's typically protection, and then if you choose the first one, it's to try to end the game. And if you have the commander out, you can just do both, and that's pretty much a finisher as long as you have a big enough board state to get all the damage through. Because they have protection from all colors until the end of turn, they can't block with anything except for colorless artifact creatures. Well, or colorless creatures, whatever. And lastly, we have Enlightened Tutor, which is 1 to search your library for an artifact or an enchantment card, reveal it, and then put it on top of your library. So with this, it allows us to go get whatever we might need in that situation. And we run some great artifacts and enchantments in this deck. So now let's talk about them. First up, we've got our mana rocks, which is Sol Ring, Arcane Signet. Now we've got Ashnod's Altar, which is 3, sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless. This is a good card in this deck because we have so many tokens that we will have the ability to sacrifice some of them to provide us with some mana if needed. Next up, we've got the One Ring, which is 4 colorless for a legendary artifact that has indestructible. When the One Ring enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you gain protection from everything until your next turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on the One Ring. You tap the One Ring to put a burden counter on the One Ring, then draw a card for each burden counter on the One Ring. So this can get a lot of cards in your hand as the game goes on. Also nice to be able to cast it and then swing out on that turn because you have indestructible, or because you have protection from everything. Next up, we have a little bit of ramp. First, we have Gauntlet of Power. It is an artifact that says as Gauntlet of Power enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures of the chosen color get +1/+1. Whenever a basic land is tapped for mana of the chosen color, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of that color. And in mono white, that's great. We run mostly plains. The only thing about Gauntlet of Power is it does cause your opponent's plains to also tap for 2 white. Next, we have Caged Sun, which is essentially the same thing as Gauntlet of Power, but it costs 6, and it's only creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1, and lands that you control get the additional mana. Next up, we've got Skull Clamp, a fantastic artifact that says equipped creature gets +1/-1. Whenever the equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards. And the equip cost is 1, and the initial cast is 1. So essentially, pay 1, equip it to a 1/1, it dies, draw 2 cards. So pay 1, sack a creature, and draw 2 cards. A really great card, especially in this deck where we're making 1/1s constantly. Next, we've got Staff of the Storyteller. It is 1 and a white that says when Staff of the Storyteller enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. Whenever you create 1 or more creature tokens, put a story counter on Staff of the Storyteller. Then you can pay 1, tap it, remove a story counter from Staff of the Storyteller, and draw a card. Next, we have Horn of Gondor, also from the new Lord of the Rings set. When Horn of Gondor enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Then you can pay 3, tap this, and create X 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, where X is the number of humans you control. We do have a lot of humans, and a lot of the tokens we make are also humans, so that can potentially get out of hand really quickly. Next up, we've got Oketra's Monument, which is 3 for an artifact that says white creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so a little reduction. And then whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with vigilance. And finally, our last artifact is potentially a finisher for us, which is Eldrazi Monument. Eldrazi Monument is 5 for an artifact that says creatures you control get +1/+1 and have flying and indestructible. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. If you can't, sacrifice Eldrazi Monument instead. So Eldrazi Monument gives everything flying and +1/+1, so that potentially gives us a win right there as well. Now for enchantments, we've got Teleportation Circle, 3 and a white, for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So it's just a way to blink things at the end of your end step. So you can blink an artifact that makes creatures, you can blink a creature that removes something. It just gives you the opportunity to bounce stuff. Next up, we've got Land Tax, which is 1 white for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for up to 3 basic land cards, reveal them, and then put them into your hand, then shuffle. So in the early game, this just makes sure we have lands in hand so that we don't miss any land drops, which is super important in mono white. And then it also thins our deck out. If we have plenty of lands in hand, we can just discard those basics and keep going. Next, we have Dawn of a New Age, another Lord of the Rings card for 1 and a white that says Dawn of the New Age enters the battlefield with a hope counter for each creature you control. At the beginning of your end step, you remove a hope counter from Dawn of a New Age. If you do, draw a card. Then, whenever Dawn of the New Age has no hope counters on it, sacrifice it and gain 4 life. Next, we have Flowering of the White Tree, also from Lord of the Rings. It is white and says legendary creatures you control have +2/+1 and have ward 1. Non-legendary creatures you control get +1/+1. Next, we've got Felidar Retreat. It is 3 and a white. This enchantment says Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose 1. Create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain vigilance until the end of turn. This card does serious work in this deck. It's constantly spitting out cats, and it's constantly buffing up your stuff every turn. It is a very good enchantment. Next, we have Haunted Library for 1 and a white. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. Next, we've got Wedding Announcement. It is 2 and a white. At the beginning of your end step, put an invitation counter on Wedding Announcement. If you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn, draw a card. Otherwise, create a 1/1 white human creature token. Then if Wedding Announcement has 3 or more invitation counters on it, transform it. And when you transform it, it becomes an enchantment that just says creatures you control get +1/+1. Next up, we've got Monologue Tax. It is 2 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token. So not as good as Smothering Tithe, but still good. Speaking of, next we have Smothering Tithe. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a colorless treasure artifact token with tap and sacrifice this artifact to add 1 mana of any color. So good. Next, we have Blessed Sanctuary, 3 white for an enchantment that says prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white unicorn creature token. So there, you're going to be making a bunch of unicorns. And lastly, we have Anointed Procession, which is 3 and a white for an enchantment that says if an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice as many of those tokens instead. So just another token doubler. Next up, we've got our lands for this deck. It is mostly basics, but we've got a handful of utility lands that do some work in here. First up, we've got Hall of Heliod's Generosity. It taps for a colorless, and then you can pay 1 and a white to tap it, put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. So just a way to get some of these enchantments back, especially things like Anointed Procession, Smothering Tithe, etc. Next, we've got Maze of Ith. It is a land that says tap, and it says untap target attacking creature. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by that creature this turn. So it's just a way to give ourselves a little bit of protection against something big. Next, we have Minas Tirith. It is a legendary land that says Minas Tirith enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary creature. It taps for a white, and then you can pay 1 and a white to draw a card. Activate only if you attacked with 2 or more creatures this turn. Next, we've got Reliquary Tower. Taps for a colorless and gives you no maximum hand size. We also have Rogue's Passage. Taps for a colorless, and then you can pay for and tap it. Target creature can't be blocked this turn. And then lastly, we have Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, a legendary land that will tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay 2, tap it, and choose a color. Add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. Staple in any mono deck. All right, guys, basic planes fill out the rest of our deck here. We run like 36 lands, so potentially you could take a couple of those out, put in some more mana rocks, put in some more removal, whatever you kind of want to do with this. I struggled with mana the first few times playing this deck, so that's why I went heavier on the basics. This deck poops out tokens like nobody's business. You are going to be flooding the board. You are going to be causing havoc and wreaking chaos. And it is a fantastic and super fun deck to play. If you've got a Mondrax sitting around, build it. If you've got an Ozurtok sitting around, build it. They're both super fun. Can't go wrong with this. It's just a blast. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. If you like this content, please like and subscribe, comment on this video, ring that notification bell so you'll see our next videos coming up. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope you come back again, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.